Hey, everybody. Welcome to It's Not Scary, It's Just Music. It's me, SJ, again, for like the fourth or fifth time. We're already in 1983. Can you believe it? I'm so excited to get to this year because I found that in 1982, we were just starting to hit our stride with the 80s. And like I said for last episode, I think that the decade is starting to wake up a little bit. I think in 83, it's fully awake. I think that there's a lot that happened in this year that really set us on a course for where we're going for the rest of the decade. And I'm really excited for us to go through the impact of this year and the expected cascading waves that will continue to resonate over the rest of the decade. So it's very exciting stuff. Just as a reminder, make sure to check out both of my playlists that are linked in the description of this episode today, my essential list and my bigger list. As a reminder from last episode for 1982, my essential list is now just a select few tracks that I'll call out in the episode for my essential albums for the year. You can find the entire album and all the albums that I didn't necessarily talk about today, but I felt were important enough to keep for the year in my big playlist, as well as all of my conspicuous absences. So, as usual, we're going to talk about music trends, what's moving in, what's moving out, what's on right now, what the essential albums and the specific tracks are for this year that I've selected and why, and then my conspicuous absences from the essential list and why. So, before I get into talking about music trends, I just wanted to call out something really quickly. What I will tell you is that some of this stuff is some of the trends that exist in a particular year. We're not going to be talking about necessarily in these episodes or even will be highlighted in my essential albums because I just don't think that they're meaningful enough in order to rise to the level of all of our awareness that we really need to be paying attention to it. And there's also stuff that's happening down on my big list that might be too early, so like more underground, and it hasn't risen to the level of what's moving in yet for any of us to pay attention during this podcast. So just getting it into your head that sometimes there will be trends that exist in my big list or movements that you might see the entire trend line happen in the entirety of my big list across several years, but it never rises to my essentials or in the podcast, right? So I would encourage you that if you are interested in not missing much, that you go through, and you don't have to peel through the 100 some odd hours every single year for, in all of my big lists. But I would encourage you to just have that frame of reference that if there's perhaps a sound that you know and understand did exist during this era and we never talk about it and it comes and goes and we never referenced it, that either it's in my big list and we just don't talk about it, or it was of a level of rated quality that it just went totally under the radar. Like I know that there's a lot of pop that happens, especially in the 90s, that we just are never going to go there. We're going to sidestep the whole entire era because none of those albums hit a level of quality that was noteworthy for me. So just a frame of reference as we keep moving along here. So anyway, let's talk about music trends for 1983. What's moving in? Unfortunately for me, because I don't enjoy it very much, hair metal is definitely moving in. It's the evolution off of the new wave of heavy metal. Hair metal in and of itself has its own flavor, its own vibe. There's a lot higher pitched singing. There's a lot more electric guitar riffs that are, kind of screeching through, and there's a lot more echoey sounds. Like, we'll talk about one particular example about why hair metal, I think, is actually moving in when we talk about my essential albums. So I'm going to try and be as excited as I can. I really don't like hair metal, but I'm going to call out its importance in the 80s and how it impacts as much as I can. But again, kind of like we were talking about a second ago, there's not a lot of super high quality hair metal albums. And so you'll kind of see these spikes a little bit. And I'll try to do what I can in order to keep those frame of references in mind for you as we're going along here. But hair metal is a really great example of, I'm not going to be tracking it very closely. It'll spike up every once in a while, kind of like the neo-traditionalist country thing, which is also still moving in. It'll spike up a little bit, but I'm not calling out any of these albums in my essentials, right? If you want to be listening to what the early stuff sounds like or how it's carried over from the 70s, you got to check out the big list in order to hear some of this stuff, because I'm not going to really reference it. So just make sure you go check that out. Also, what's moving in? Rap. We've been talking about it for a while. Honestly, I think probably by 84, I think it's going to be on trend. It's getting really, really close, but not exactly quite there yet. And the reason that I know that is that turntablism is also starting to become a thing as well as beatboxing. And so those two components, which are coming in kind of parallel path or maybe even like right behind rap, is helping to push the rap sound more to the forefront and rap becoming a little bit more commonplace as some of these a little bit more challenging subgenres are coming about. So rap is definitely on the way in. Turntablism is coming in kind of parallel right with it. And for those that don't know, turntablism is on the side of, in addition to avant-garde, taking turntablism and avant-garde and some of the electronic music that we've been listening to with like industrial, we didn't listen to Kraftwerk, but like Yellow Magic Orchestra, putting all that together and inevitably becoming electronica. And turntablism has a huge hand in driving electronica. So turntablism is definitely on the way in electronica. It must not be, more than a few years behind it. So get ready. Next, speed, thrash, black metal. Obviously, black metal started last year in 82 with Venom, black metal. Speed metal has been kind of getting played with for the last couple of years, like Diamond Head was doing a little bit of that. Obviously, punk has been playing their guitars and playing their drums really fast for a really long time. That's nothing new. And then Venom also was kind of pushing the envelope there along with speed metal. So it's still on the way. It's not quite here all the way yet, but it's definitely on the way. And we'll talk about why when we get to the essentials. New wave Brit rock. So we referenced it last year. And with Psychedelic Furs, Echo and the Bunnymen much earlier had that sound. And so there's going to be this splintering off between the Paisley Underground, which the Psychedelic Furs really helped drive, and then this new wave Brit rock idea, which is fundamentally different sound, but it's also very distinctive in its own right. And the new wave Brit rock will eventually give way to more consistent, more commercial Brit rock, like think about Oasis or Blur or when we start to get into the 90s. So we're getting there. And then one of the things that probably almost nobody who's listening to this podcast has any interest in or is paying attention to whatsoever, but what in Japan is called anison, which is anime music. So music that is played for the openings or closings of anime shows or movies. It's a whole genre that exists in Japan. It continues today. I would say it's completely gobbled up most pop music in Japan, at least in the late 90s, 2000s, 2010s. Like, it's highly prolific. In many ways, it's become the dominant force in J-pop. So it kind of starts in 1983, and I'll talk about it as we go along here, but it's the beginning of that. Anyway, so what is right now? City pop is officially here. It was officially here last year. It's very much officially here. I would say it's hitting even higher peaks this year. There's still a lot left to play around with, and a lot more from a record producer standpoint, a lot more money to make off of this one sound. So we're going to stick with this for a little while. It does continue to evolve and change shape, and we'll call that out as we go along today. Next, pop punk. I would say it's definitely right now, and like last year with Missing Persons, Spring Session M, I said that was, in quote, a precursor to Cyndi Lauper and Madonna. The thing is, I actually think that Cyndi Lauper and Madonna started doing their thing a year, or so before Missing Persons. So I think that Missing Persons just got out in front of them with their album before the other two did. But that whole pop punk idea is totally in the zeitgeist now. Cyndi Lauper and Madonna, as I said last year, they essentially cleared off the whole table of whatever we were doing around pop music, and they've taken this hyper commercial version of punk music and turned it into what we define as pop music for, I would argue, that at least the next 10 years, right? Like, until we really get into like boy bands and Britney Spears and things like that. Like, this is kind of what it is for the foreseeable future, which is really exciting for those that are really excited about this kind of music. But also, this is a milestone in musical history. And then finally, alternative rock. It's firmly established itself. There's a bunch of different approaches going on here. I think that there's one or two really fundamental alternative rock albums that come out this year that essentially have put new wave of heavy metal and the whole kind of heavy metal idea, not the sort of splinter offs of speed metal and thrash and stuff. That's its own thing. But the new wave and the traditional heavy metal is on the shelf. We're done with that now. And to that end, what's moving out? New wave of heavy metal. It's done. It's not totally passé yet, but I would say at this point, if you're listening to a record that's in the vein of like a Diamond Head, it's starting to sound a little played out, which, is unfortunate. And then the other one, new wave synth pop. I mean, I promised in 1982 that we were going to probably be on the way out this very next year, and it's true. Some of the stuff you hear, especially on the synth pop side, you're sitting there going, yeah, okay, I've heard all this stuff before. I'm ready to move on. That's how you know that we're starting to move out, that you're getting a little bit tired of it. Even if there's still hits that are generating, it's definitely late stage, right? So you're hearing this and going, yeah, you're a little late to the party on this one, but I acknowledge that this is a hit. That's how you know that things are starting to move out. All right, let's talk about our essential albums for this year and why. First, let's talk about our essential albums for 1983. First, Henri, timely, with 2 exclamation points. You may recall Henri from the 1979 J-Pop Check-In. Well, she's been making albums this whole time, and to me, timely is a pinnacle for her. I think if you use Spotify listens as a gauge, I think most people agree that timely is her peak album, even though she continues to make quality albums, at least for the next decade, before city pop as an idea kind of wanes and other much more current trends have kind of overtaken her sound. But Timely is really a fantastic album. As I said, I think you should line Henri's Timely up with Cyndi Lauper's She's So Unusual, which we're going to talk about here in a little bit, and Madonna by Madonna. They're not so far away in terms of quality. I think we're all sort of used to in the Western world She's So Unusual, the album, and Madonna, and you're probably not nearly as familiar with Henri. I would just give that unbiased listen as much as you can, knowing full well that you probably know all the lyrics to a lot of the songs on both of the Cyndi Lauper and the Madonna albums, just because you want to hear how far city pop has come, how far J-pop has come in terms of its production quality and where it is right now. So the tracks specifically, so we talked about anime music. Cat's Eye is, I would say, probably Henri's gigantic hit. And it's because Cat's Eye was a song that was the introduction to an anime called Cat's Eye, I think. So it's wildly popular. It's considered to be one of the very early, or if not the first, songs that was produced for an anime by a pop star. I'm sure it happened before, but anime is really starting to find its legs in 1983. So because of that, this is just the introduction and the beginning to sort of merging the two universes of J-pop idols like Henri and anime and putting them together into sort of one media conglomeration. And it's both sad from a, I would say, corporate music standpoint, and also really exciting because it means that there's a lot of musical inspiration that's to come and a lot of, I would say, corporate investment in trying to push a lot of this high quality production in J-pop going forward. So it's pretty exciting. In addition to Cat's Eye, Windy Summer to me is one of my favorite songs from this whole year period. I Can't Stop the Loneliness and Remember Summer Days are all really great tracks on that album. They're some of her most popular tracks of all time. So give those a listen. At least listen to Cat's Eye and Windy Summer. Like I said, this album is very expertly produced. It's clear that whoever was producing Henri and this album wanted to invest heavily in making it really great, making it as professional as it possibly can, and really trying to boost up the credibility of both her and the J-pop industry as a whole, and just kind of show its credibility. So it's very, very expertly produced. I can't praise it enough how well it's produced. Next, Cocteau Twins, Head Over Heels. This is new wave / avant-garde. To me, Cocteau Twins is really interesting because I think that they're a precursor to a lot. I mean, I think they're a precursor to most of the trip hop movement of the early 90s, mid 90s. It has to be some kind of inspiration for Bjork also. Cocteau Twins in this case is kind of giving a roadmap towards creating this sort of underground, cool, highly avant-garde, but highly accessible sort of record. 510, 50-fold, and Sugar Hiccup are both excellent tracks to me that are highly accessible and show the creativity and the inspiration that Cocteau Twins is exuding. So go check those two out. If you like the rest of it, go check out the rest of it. Next, Cyndi Lauper, She's So Unusual. It's new wave pop, but also this sort of punk thing that we've been talking about. If you really pay attention, like with trained ears, like we've been listening to these slow little changes that have been happening since 79 up until this moment, and with those trained ears, you should be able to hear those punk influences influences. You can hear the Go-Go's. You can hear B-52s. You obviously can hear the comparison with Missing Persons from last year, right? There's a lot of those influences or similarities there. So again, where perhaps you heard some of her tracks in a vacuum, either on the radio, or if you're younger and you just are familiar with Cyndi Lauper, Girls Want to Have Fun, stuff like that, that going back and listening through with those trained ears, you should be able to hear what her inspiration is and where she took it from. Like, she didn't just invent some of this stuff in a vacuum. She's clearly got a huge wealth of creativity that she's pulling from, like, no doubt. She has a very clear vision on what she wants to accomplish. She executes all of this extraordinarily confidently, and her sound is totally hers. And anybody that turns on the radio knows that it's Cyndi Lauper or somebody that's trying to sound like her. Just tracks to call out. Money Changes Everything. It's the first track. It's a really great introduction to her in case you've never heard it before or you've never heard of Cyndi Lauper before somehow. Like, no shade. If this is your first time hearing about who Cyndi Lauper is, then Money Changes Everything is a great way to introduce yourself to her. Girls Just Want to Have Fun. Obviously, that's one of her gargantuan, gigantic hits that still resonates today. Talk about a big bang, right? Like, Girls Just Want to Have Fun was an explosion of creativity and thoughtfulness, and I don't even know what. I mean, she just puts so many great little pieces together of so many different influences and creates this tremendous track. There's so much to say about Girls Just Want to Have Fun as an idea. And also, it's following the really interesting thing that we're minimally, incrementally starting to see here, which is the female empowerment movement that's weaving its way through the 80s. There have been a couple albums that have come out so far, some of which I've even called out in my essentials, but necessarily haven't talked about this specific subject. But that trend line that has been making its way through some of the music that we've been listening to so far starts to rise to the level of awareness that your average listener of music would become aware of it. Like, her and Madonna are really painting a picture of a strong, independent woman that is just trying to do their own thing, live their own life. And that creates a meaningful movement, I think, for a lot of people in the 80s at the time. And it does kind of go off of that counterculture punk movement that you can't hold me down. I'm going to be my own person. I'm going to do what I want to do. Girls Just Want to Have Fun. So it's really inspired and really inspiring stuff. I mean, it's just fantastic. Time After Time is her other gigantic, unbelievably huge hit. To me, All Through the Night and Witness are also two really great tracks. I mean, I just rattled off 5 tracks off of this album that might be 12 tracks. There's too many hits on this album to count. It's an amazing, amazing album. It's one of the best, strongest albums probably of the decade. Arguable, unarguable. Take it for what you will. Next, something that is far less known and familiar to people, more than likely, even from the 80s, is Daniel Johnston's Hi, How Are You? It's avant-garde. It's very unusual. Like, talk about she's so unusual. Daniel Johnston is unusual. It's very calculated. It's very intentional, but it's also very vulnerable insofar as Daniel Johnston is trying something extraordinarily new and different, which is to say that he's making it very challenging for you to enjoy and appreciate his work. He uses a lot of unconventional instruments in order to make the music, but it is still rock music nonetheless. It's like avant-garde plus alternative rock put together. To me, it makes the Raincoats by the Raincoats sound like pop music. This is highly ambitious. It's fairly complex. Talk about our complexity scale from several episodes ago. This one is tough. It's not assaulting, but it's tough. But if you really do sit down and listen to it, specifically Poor You, Big Business Monkey, and Walking the Cow, all 3 of those tracks will give you a good flavor for what this is. I find it to be tremendously enjoyable and entertaining, especially because I know what comes in the future that Daniel Johnston has influenced. So I would give this one a listen, at least Poor You. Like, just try the first one, or maybe the first 2 tracks, just so you really get that vibe. And if you like it, keep going. And if you don't like it, at least you would have exposed yourself to something new and a little challenging. Next, Def Leppard, Pyromania. You could hear my voice went down a little bit. There's definitely a hair metal component to it. Def Leppard, I think, doesn't define the genre of hair metal necessarily, but there is clearly ushering us away from new wave of heavy metal towards hair metal. And for that, I honor them. You could hear the malaise and the disdain and the sadness in my voice. I don't like hair metal. I think it's very trite. I think it's ridiculous. I think that the topics that they sing about are ludicrous, over-sexualization. It's nonsense. But the thing is, I do acknowledge and understand and identify its roots in punk, in new wave of British heavy metal. Like, I get it. I see the connections, and I would invite you all to do so also, right? Because it's not that this stuff is scary, right? None of this stuff is scary. It's just music. Like Daniel Johnston, it's not scary, it's just music. Def Leppard, Pyromania, it's not scary, it's just music. And I myself, I'm trying to do what I can to check my biases just because I don't like hair metal. But I acknowledge its importance and significance in the annals of music history. So let's just give it all a listen. Photograph, Too Late for Love, two excellent examples of where the movement of hair metal is starting to find its roots. So give them a listen, because I honor the fact that it is great for what it's doing and what it's trying to do, but it's just not for me. Sorry. But it's also not a conspicuous absence, because it's meaningful. It's tremendously essential to the year and what it provided to the genre of heavy metal music. So give it a listen just for the history's sake, or if you really love Def Leppard, go for it. That was mostly for my dad, by the way. Go for it, Dad. Listen to Def Leppard to your heart's content. Next, Madonna by Madonna. It's pop music. It's not nearly as detectable as She's So Unusual, the punk element, but it's not invisible and it's not completely absent. You really have to listen for it, because Lucky Star makes it really hard. Borderline makes it really hard. Burning Up, it's a little bit easier to detect, that it's a little bit more Go-Go's-esque, and so you can use the Go-Go's to kind of ground yourself to connect back to the past. But as we said, Madonna coming out with this record is clearing the tables. She's officially saying, whatever we've been doing with pop, like in the 70s, whatever, we're done with all that. We're doing what I'm doing now. I mean, I think that when she was on American Bandstand, right, with Dick Clark, and she did Lucky Star, she said she was going to take over the world. I think we probably should have listened to her, because she did inevitably take over the world, and this was the beginning of all of it. Her style, her and Cyndi Lauper both. Like, Cyndi Lauper comes in with the crazy pink and everything, but Madonna comes in with the black and, the lace and this and that and the other, everything that we know about Madonna. So it's two different vibes of the same idea, but they're both kind of pushing that same angle. And obviously Madonna has not more staying power, because both are still tremendously popular even today. But I think that Madonna kind of keeps evolving out of her 80s roots, where I think Cyndi Lauper is kind of firmly defined in the 80s. So Madonna is one for the ages. Lucky Star, Borderline, and Burnin' Up to me are the three best, or at least my favorites of this year, and the best articulation of what she's doing here. So in case you haven't listened to them or haven't listened to them in a long time, give them a listen, because all three of them are great. One thing I will call out about this record, which I find to be kind of funny, is that for a pop album, these tracks are too long. They're too long. 4 minutes, 5 minutes, crazy. She's lucky that Lucky Star and Borderline are both really great, so you can kind of keep going with them. But like by minute 4, you are kind of wondering why we're still listening to this song a little bit. But they're all really great. They're really famous tracks. I'd like to think that she does start to have a little bit stronger editing going forward, but at least in this moment, some of these tracks are still a little on the raw side and, probably require a little bit more editing, but it's Madonna. Next, Malcolm McLaren, Duck Rock. This is turntablism / rap. So it's both. He does a little bit of turntablism. He does a little bit of rap. Buffalo Gals is on this album, which, in case you haven't heard it, go listen to it and you go, oh yeah, it's that song. And then El Sanjuanera, both great tracks on this album. It's a pretty short album. It gives you a really good sense of early turntablism and where we're going with it, and then inevitably what's going to turn into many different sects of electronica over the next several years. So this was a rare, straight ahead kind of turntablist record very early in its existence, because turntablism doesn't really start to become a thing that people widely listen to, or that is strong enough and distinctive enough in its own thing in the pantheon of electronica until the early mid-90s maybe. So this is really early turntablism, showing you that it's not just about the rap, that there's also DJs that are just focusing on becoming experts at being turntablists. So it's really cool, fun stuff. Next, Marine Girls, Lazy Ways. It's twee pop. You might remember that this is Tracy Thorn. So Tracy Thorn is a part of Marine Girls, and Marine Girls is on the way towards Everything But the Girl, which comes the very next year after this and then is that way henceforth. Like I said, it's twee pop. It's her own thing. She's just continuing on this trend of whatever this thing that has been uncovered, like a beautiful seashell in the sand, she's rolling with it, whatever this is. This inspiration seems to have no end to it, and there's plenty to play around with. I can assure you that it is going to continue to evolve even further, especially if you do remember Everything But the Girl's major hit from the early 90s. You know that we're not anywhere near that yet if you listen to some of these tracks. The only one I'm going to call out specifically that I really implore you to listen to is A Place in the Sun. I would challenge you to listen to this and not think that Holiday by Weezer is essentially the same song. I know it's not the same song because I don't want to get sued by Weezer, but Rivers Cuomo was listening to Marine Girls and all this twee pop. There's no way that he wasn't. So this is a really fantastic album. I think I've already articulated my bias towards Tracy Thorn and everything that she does, so don't listen to me. Just go check out A Place in the Sun, and if you like it, keep going, and if you don't, I respect you and I honor your curiosity, and we can all move forward together. Next, Martha and the Muffins, Dance Park, spelled in a really crazy way, Danceparc. It's new wave. It's one of the kind of rare holdovers of new wave while it's still kind of moving out. And the reason I call this out is just because I think that they're playing with a lot of Talking Heads elements mixed with alternative elements. And so they're much like all these other artists that are trying to figure out ways in order to connect the past to what's either now or in the future. This is another example where Martha and the Muffins are trying to take the Talking Heads ideas that existed in 79, 80, maybe even 81, and find their place with this new emerging sound in alternative rock. It's really interesting to watch that evolution and them play with these ideas a lot. Obedience and Walking into Walls are two really great examples of trying to put all those pieces together to see what sticks. I love seeing experimentation like this just because, being a musical time traveler as I am, I know what they're hinting at, even if they don't know what they're hinting at, because I've read ahead. Like, I know what comes after this. But to watch them work through some of these experimentations is really fun and entertaining for me. And hopefully it is for you too, because you can hear some of those later influences down the line. It's really good stuff. Next, Metallica, Kill 'Em All. It's speed metal. I would argue that they kind of invented this. Just like Venom invented black metal, Metallica really kind of owns speed metal. It's playing music fast like punk music, but it's clearly metal. And the thing that's really excellent about this album, where I know that they have a lot of albums after this that are killers, like I know that Ride the Lightning is next year, is that in this year, you can hear that they're still kind of sort of a punk band, which is really great. Like Hit the Lights is a really great example of how you can really still detect that they're not the Metallica of later, where they're playing Enter Sandman or whatever. Like, they are still kind of a punk band that is just playing their electric guitars a little bit harder than your average punk band does. And the phrasing and how the lead singer sings, like, it all has that kind of punk vibe a little bit. Especially, again, if you've got those trained ears, having listened to some of this stuff from prior years, you can hear the connections between the past. And then Seek and Destroy is one of their great gigantic hits. It's probably their first gigantic hit that they ever had. And you can hear a little bit more that they were trying to push the envelope with what speed metal was going to become with Seek and Destroy, because it sounds a lot less punky and a lot more like what they eventually become. So just those two tracks on the same album, you can hear how even just while they were making the record, they were evolving, which is just really cool stuff. It's a really great album and a really fun view into the moment when things were changing and the moment when this subgenre was just kind of first being birthed into the universe. It's really good stuff. Next, Pylon, Chomp. This is alternative rock. To me, this is a great example, especially if you listen to K, Yo-Yo, Beep, Crazy, which I know are all really fun and interesting track names. I referenced 4 of them because there's 4 really great tracks. There probably is even more than that on this album, but those were the 4 that I called out. All really great examples of trying to bridge what was, which to me is like that B-52s-esque sound, to, I would say, grunge. You know, there's a lot of really proto early grunge elements in what Pylon is doing in this album, but you can hear how they're hinting at some of the stuff that's in the future that probably will inspire people to do it even more so down the line when we officially get to grunge. But then also kind of taking those older punk ideas, those older new wave ideas that were happening with the B-52s even in 79. It's really fun to see, again, those pieces get put together. As I said, the decade is starting to wake up a little bit, and part of that waking up process is just more aggressively playing with what was and what will be, putting it together and trying to create those bridges to the future. That's really cool stuff. A band that's firmly oriented themselves towards the future, not even focused on what came before us for the most part, REM, Murmur. I mean, Radio Free Europe is on this album. It's the one specifically that I called out that you need to listen to from this record. It's groundbreaking. It's fundamental. It's so alternative rock. It hurts. It sounds like something that should have been playing in 1993 or 1994, and we're only in 1983. This sound is 8 to 10 years ahead of its time. This is great stuff. It's just wild to hear them take all of those alternative elements that everybody's been playing with and kind of swirling around for a couple years at this point, and then they just put it all together to this perfect package. Radio Free Europe is a great track one, side one, kind of like Hell's Bells. Radio Free Europe is another really excellent way to both start an album, introduce you to a band, introduce you to a sound. It's all really great stuff. I mean, give that one a listen. All the rest of them have that similar vibe to them. The lead singer of REM has a very distinctive voice. It's just great. Just give it a listen. Next, hey, this is the first time that we have 2 Japanese artists and albums in my essential list, right? We started with Henri at the very top and now Shonen Knife. This is like J-punk. It's not even J-rock, it's J-punk. And it's also kind of following in that Fang area where they're not playing their instruments very well, probably on purpose. They're not singing in harmonies at all, probably on purpose, because they just sound like they don't care at all, which is really great stuff. It's really irreverent, which I love. You don't even need to understand Japanese to know how irreverent this is, just in how they sound. It's really great stuff. Miracles, Twist Barbie, and then Elephant Pow Pow. 3 excellent tracks on this record. I would actually argue this is a little bit post-Plastics from a couple of years ago. For those of you that are checking out our Instagram, I used one of the tracks from the Plastics album to highlight one of our episodes. Some of these tracks, like I think Elephant Pow Pow specifically, sounds pretty close to that. Just give this one a listen. It's super fun. Like I said, you don't even really have to understand Japanese to understand how irreverent this is. And juxtapose this to what's going on with Henri. Totally different ideas, totally different universes. They might as well just live in totally different galaxies from each other, but yet they're still generating this kind of music coming out of Japan. And I would argue that it's kind of matching up and blending together with what's going on in the West, right? Like I said, the J-pop check-ins are over. The training wheels are off. The Japanese music industry is clearly finding its foothold, and we're just going to keep calling out the greatness every time it happens. So check that one out, Shonen Knife. Super duper influential. We haven't even gotten to the awesomeness of Shonen Knife just yet, or the cascading implications of where their sound eventually takes us, which, by the way, are very wonderful places, which we'll get to for sure. So check them out because they're the beginning of just tremendously amazing counterculture things going on in Japan for sure. Next, The Chameleons' Script of the Bridge. Here's what I'll say about this album. First of all, it's one of my favorite albums of all time, period, be it in the 80s or otherwise. I was not aware of the Chameleons before I did this project the first time. I was not aware at all of Script of the Bridge or the Chameleons at all, period, before this. And this album, when I listened to it, even in 2009 when I did the project for the first time, blew my mind how amazing it was. It was so forward thinking. It was so firmly establishing this sort of alternative Brit rock idea. It was the beginning, to my estimation, of so many rock ideas coming out of England. And yet I'd never heard of them. I'd never been aware of them. I can't imagine they're super popular or people know them widely even today. This album to me is a time capsule, certainly of 1983, but also you could play this album almost any time over the next 20 years and it still sounds at least marginally relevant, which is pretty astounding. Whatever was happening here with them in this moment, I could not possibly tell you, but the amount of inspiration and creativity that they've jam-packed into this album, and they do it with such confidence, is mind-blowing to me. I believe that they're a Psychedelic Furs kind of offshoot, so there's a little bit of that Paisley thing going on, but it's mostly its own sound. To be totally honest with you, this sound, I believe, will push the Psychedelic Furs all the way out of the zeitgeist, something like this, because it's clearly taking a lot of their sounds, but then just catapulting them into this totally different place. And I believe it will inspire countless artists to come that will make, people not even really think as much about the Psychedelic Furs, which I think is pretty astounding because this is like their first album. They just leapt out there and boom, they're making a play for knocking the Psychedelic Furs off their perch. Like that's kind of astounding to me that they could jump out there so confidently. I would argue you could listen to just about any track on this album and get their vibe. My recommendations, though, Don't Fall, Here Today, Second Skin, Up the Down Escalator. All 4 of them to me are amazing tracks. Again, I'm hyper biased, but I also walked into the Chameleon Script of the Bridge knowing nothing, not a thing. And I still listened to it and went, whoa, this is really great stuff. So give this one a listen. I implore you. I beg of you. Go to my list and listen to these 4 tracks. Listen to the rest if you want to. I don't want this band to be as underground as it is, even if it's not even hardly underground. They deserve far more accolades than they've ever gotten, in my opinion. So go throw your ears at them, please. Next, the Pointer Sisters Break Out. It's post-disco R&B pop. The interesting thing about this album, much like Shaka Khan's album from last year and Michael Jackson's Thriller and stuff like that, is that there's these albums that are coming out here and there that are really pushing R&B into the realm of just being straight up pop, where it's becoming part of popular zeitgeist music and it's not its own specific genre. Like R&B is becoming the standard for what pop music sounds like. Like if it weren't for Cyndi Lauper and Madonna, this R&B sound, like the Thriller sound or, Shaka Khan or what the Pointer Sisters are doing here with Breakout, even if it is post-disco R&B, it could so easily just become what popular music sounds like going forward. And it sounds like, so the Pointer Sisters breakout is just another way that they're elbowing their way into becoming the pop standard sound going forward. Jump, hyper popular song. Automatic, another hyper popular song. I'm so excited, also super popular. And the Neutron Dance, which Neutron Dance to me isn't on my essentials, but I acknowledge that it's one of their wildly popular songs. One thing that I'll also call out about this album is that it's like an evolution of Prince somehow, which is funny to say because Prince seems to have no end to his creativity or where he thinks he can go with his sounds. And it still sounds like they're building off of a lot of at least what Prince was doing in 79, right? Like what Prince is doing in 1982 with 1999 and everything on that album, that's kind of blasting off into outer space. But at the very least, the Pointer Sisters in this case are paying attention to what Prince was doing in 79, where he was merging pop music and new wave and R&B and disco together into this new different kind of thing. And they're moving it along to the next stage. A lot of these tracks are just, I would say, straight ahead pop music, but they have R&B conventions or artifacts kind of baked in. And so it's really awesome to see because the Pointer Sisters are great. Automatic is one of my favorite songs in the 80s. And so, you know, it's always great to give them their props and their accolades because, I mean, a lot of people like the Pointer Sisters, love the Pointer Sisters, would die for the Pointer Sisters. I would say I'm somewhere in that camp because I really respect a lot of what they've done. If you haven't given any or all of these tracks a listen for a long time, or maybe you've never really sat down and listened to them meaningfully or thoughtfully, give them a listen. They're all really great. The whole album is like this. Give it a listen. And then finally, Violent Femmes. This is alternative rock. I might even argue that it's indie rock before indie rock was a thing. To me, what's so funny about this album is much like Young Marble Giants or the Soft Boys, where they were just catapulting over what was coming and then just landing on the other side. I would argue that Violent Femmes was a little bit doing it like that too, where alternative rock was just starting to kind of come up onto the plateau and find its footing on stable ground. And Violent Femmes are just saying, yeah, that's great and all, but I'm just going to slingshot my way all the way to the other end and start off with indie rock and just go somewhere totally different than you guys. Which is great because it's a hyper influential album, obviously. This sort of slacker, I don't care about how I play or how I sing or what I'm singing about is alive and well in this album. It's really great. The thing I would also call out is that, much like we were talking about last year, with the retro sound of the 60s starting to come back, because 20 to 25 years ago was about 1960, 1963, they're incorporating some retro rock and roll components into the punk and into the alternative rock, and they're making this new kind of, but they're doing it lackadaisically, like this slacker idea, but it's also kind of emerging the eventual like indie rock sound that happens in the late, mid-late 90s, early 2000s. This album is unbelievably influential, and I'm sure that everybody and their mother has heard Blister in the Sun, and if you haven't, and you've never gone to a baseball game in the last 10 to 15 years, give Blister in the Sun a listen. It's really great. It's a really great example of how is it that this was happening in 1983. Well, Violent Femmes were amazing. They could see where the plateau was going to end for alternative rock and just went all the way on the other side and started to talk about indie rock, which is so cool. Other ones, Kiss Off, Added Up, Gone Daddy Gone. All four of those tracks are really excellent, including Blister in the Sun. So go give that a listen if you haven't. Check them all out. All right, so that was it for this year. Only 16. That's not too many, and we're not doing a J-pop check-in. So this was kind of a light year, but it was really dense. Like, there was only 16 albums, but there was a lot going on in these 16 albums. So I think my essential list is maybe only like a couple hours, maybe 2.5 hours, because some of these albums I pulled a lot of tracks from. So go give the whole thing a listen. It's really great stuff. There's so much greatness. There's so many treasures in this essential list for this year. 83 was just a tremendous year. Can't deny it. Next, let's do a little bit of our conspicuous absences. So, Seiko Matsuda, Canary. I referenced for 1 second, maybe even in 79, Seiko Matsuda, who is, I would say, widely considered to be the greatest city pop artist of all time, the greatest J-pop idol of all time. I mean, she's gotten so many accolades, it's ridiculous. She's come out with 700 million albums. This album itself is really great city pop. If you go back into the big list and give, I would say, even the first track a listen of Canary, line that up to Timely by Henri and just hear how Henri just has so much more oomph behind her. Her singing is much punchier. The instrumentation's a lot punchier. There's a lot more of a perspective there than I think in Canary. But I do honor that Seiko Matsuda is like astounding. But at least in this year, Henri is just kicking her posterior all over the place. So that's why it's in my big list. It is a great album and a great example of city pop, but Henri is just crushing her. this year, no question. Next, Stevie Ray Vaughan, Texas Flood. It's an amazing record. He's an amazing guitarist. It's a widely popular album, but it's very, very niche. So it's not really fitting in necessarily to the overall evolution of music that we're discussing as part of this podcast. But I do honor that he has got his hands all the way around blues rock, and his guitar work is just fantastic. And there's no way to deny that. But I don't think it's necessary to call it out in my essential albums for the year, especially being tremendously impactful or influential, but amazing nonetheless. If you really like blues rock and you've either never heard of Stevie Ray Vaughan somehow, some way, or you haven't heard this record for a while, give it a listen. It's really great. It's kind of a time capsule. Speaking of time capsules, Tears for Fears, The Hurting, it was their first album. There's an unbelievable amount of potential in this record. You know, Pale Shelter's on this record, Mad World's on this record. Like, it's a fantastic album. But much like Psychedelic Furs in '79, I think that they still have a lot of growing to do. I think that they have a lot of great ideas and there's a lot of potential for this band. I mean, I'm talking about Tears for Fears like we don't all know that they eventually became a hyper famous, and even Pale Shelter and Mad World were like hyper famous in their own right. But like, there's still so much more growing that they need to do. And I think it wouldn't make sense for me to include it in my essentials when I know that they have a lot more in them. And it's not just because I know it's coming. It's because there was a little bit of meandering happening in this album. Some of these tracks needed to be edited a little bit better. Some of their ideas that they had for some of the tracks didn't come to fruition in their fullest possible way. Like Pale Shelter, I think is really great, but insanely long. But there's a lot of good ideas in it. So I see all the potential, even putting aside what I know about their future. So because of that conspicuous absence. Another conspicuous absence, U2, War. It was their first one. What I would challenge you to do too is compare this up to To Rai I by Dexy's Midnight Runners of last year. Remember how last year I put that in my conspicuous absences because I said there wasn't enough of a perspective there? This has the perspective that I was talking about. It's very tight. It's got a whole perspective. It's got a vision. But I think they just left a lot of meat on the bone. And this isn't necessarily saying because I know that Joshua Tree is coming. Like, I know it is. Sunday Bloody Sunday, to me, again, one of the best tracks in the entirety of the 80s. But they're not done growing, kind of like Tears for Fears, and focusing up on their inspiration. But I do completely honor that the complaint that I had about To Rai I by Dexy's Midnight Runners lacking perspective, U2 has it. They've got it. They owned it. And they took all those elements too that Dexy's Midnight Runners was using, and they put them together into that consumable package. So good on them. It was really great stuff. They just need to go a little bit further. I'm talking about U2 like they're not like hyper famous, and Bono isn't like one of the most recognizable people in the world. And then finally, ZZ Top, Eliminator. I acknowledge that this is a great album. I acknowledge that this is one of their top albums. It's just a really old sound at this point. It's already well moving out. I mean, at this point, traditional heavy metal might be passé. So this sounds quite behind. I think that there's a lot of artists that are way out ahead. Like, compare ZZ Top Eliminator to REM Murmur or like Violent Femmes. Like, their ZZ Top is way behind. But is it a really well executed album way past the trend's prime? Yes, it's actually kind of an interesting example of that, where ZZ Top is just continuing to do their thing and they put out something excellent. It's just way past when it's relevant, way past time. So very interesting moment. Having said that, this is all just one guy's opinion, right? I mean, maybe you disagree with what I said about U2. Maybe you are continuing to be offended that I said that Missing Persons somehow influenced Cyndi Lauper and Madonna when that's probably not true. Like, this is all my opinion. This is all my highly biased perspective. As I've said, I'm listening to, I'd like to believe like 70 to 80% of all the albums that came out in a year that were meaningful, but I'm sure I missed some stuff. I always miss stuff, I'm sure. But I want to hear from you. Like, what did you agree with? What did you disagree with? What did I miss? What did I learn? What did you learn? I learned a lot. I learn a lot every year. But what did you learn? I want to hear about all of this stuff from y'all. And to do that, you can always feel free to comment anytime on the podcast, either on Spotify or wherever you're listening to this. You can always comment or send us DMs on Instagram, Not Scary, Just Music Pod. You can subscribe so you can stalk us and, keep listening to our stuff and, keep having strong opinions or perspectives about it. I would welcome all of it. I want to hear all the good, the bad, and the ugly. Let me have it. I would implore you again, go check out the Essential playlist that is linked in the description of this episode. Check out the big list if you want to listen to all the stuff that's in Conspicuous Absences, or listen to the full albums for everything that I pulled snippets from for my Essential playlist. If you want to listen to some of these deep trends that aren't necessarily going to ever bubble up to the surface for this podcast, go check all that stuff out. It's all there. It's all available to you. It's all linked in the description of the podcast today. Please join us again. Please rate us. Please subscribe, like I said. Tell your friends. Tell your plants. Tell your teachers. Tell everybody. Tell your grocer. I don't know. Tell the person that works on your car or your bike. Go ahead. Because, as I said before, we're all trying to build out a community here, listening to all this music. And some of this stuff you've never heard before. Some of it you haven't heard for a while. Some of this stuff, you heard it and you hated it, like me with hair metal. But even somebody for me who's listened to all this music, and I've got quite a metabolism for all of this music and stuff, and I still can't really stand things like death metal and doom metal and hair metal and stuff, and yet I still approach it, I still engage with it, I still connect with it, and I do everything I can in order to understand the greatness of it and its inspiration, because these artists are working really hard, right? They're trying to do everything they can in order to take all these ideas, these feelings that they have, and turn it into something that connects with other people. And so because of that, we shouldn't be scared of it. We should approach it with open arms. Let's approach it with curiosity, because at the end of the day, it's just music. Right? Thanks for listening.